Chapter 15. The Americans Arrive. Helena was torn out of sleep by gunfire and screaming. With pounding heart, she listened to the sounds in the early dawn. Through 6 years of war, she had struggled to keep herself and her 4 children alive. Now the end had come. The Russians are here, she thought in horror. There's no place to hide in our apartment. Only God can help us now. Lying paralyzed with fear, she listened to the increasing commotion outside. Wait. Those aren't Russian sounds. Those men are speaking the dialect of Upper Hessen farmers. Why are they in Frankfurt? Suddenly it all came back. She and the children had made their escape from Frankfurt and had arrived in Eschenrod late the previous night. Then what was that noise? There had been no news that the Russians were close. Now fully awake, she slipped out of bed, padded barefoot across the rough floorboards to the window and looked out. The farmyard was filled with men. Their attention was focused on a mud-covered pig that was desperately trying to break through their circle. Again and again, as the men lunged for it, the slippery pig slid through their hands. Herr Straub, their landlord, shot his rifle into the air, adding to the confusion. Suddenly, Kurt, Lotte, and Gert crowded her at the window. "What are they doing to the pig, Mutti?" asked Lotte. "They are going to slaughter it." "But the pig is afraid. Just listen to how it squeals. How can they do that?" Helena put a comforting arm around her. "Lotte, this is how you get meat. You know how we sometimes eat beef. It comes from cows that are slaughtered." The men had now caught the pig and wrestled it to the ground. Herr Straub drove a dagger into its neck, and a fountain of blood mingled with the mud. 11-year-old Lotte jerked away from the window and threw herself on the bed, sobbing and retching. "I'm never ever going to eat meat again," she wept. Helena got dressed, then picked baby Susi up and changed her diapers on the bed, while the others took turns washing themselves in the icy water that had been sitting in the pitcher on the washstand all night. Downstairs in the farm kitchen, Frau Straub had already baked several loaves of bread. She invited Helena and the children to join them for a breakfast of buttered bread and Ersatzkaffee.
"What are the conditions in your city?"
Herr Straub asked her. "Most of Frankfurt is in ruins," Helena said. "Every night there is a hail of bombs as squadrons of enemy planes systematically cover the city."
"It is good that you came here," Herr Straub said kindly. "You will be safe with us. Frankfurt is no place for children at a time like this."
He reached for his battered gray felt hat and went outside to cut up the pig. Soon sides of bacon were hanging in the smokehouse to cure, and Frau Straub was boiling sausages in the big kettles usually used for doing the laundry. Helena and the children, sickened by the smell of cooking pork, returned upstairs to the room the Straubs had assigned to them. Quickly they made the 3 beds. Then 14-year-old Kurt got the Bible and read the story of God's protection of faithful Joseph. Helena led the family in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," she prayed, "for once again protecting us and bringing us safely to this haven deep in the Vogelsberg Mountains. No one at home saw us leave, and no one knows where we are. Please, God, let us have some peace here, and please watch over our papa. It has been months since we last heard from him. He was in Russia then. You know where he is now, and you can guard him there as well as you're guarding us here." The children fervently echoed her amen. They spent the whole morning placing the household items they had brought in the old dresser in their room, and hanging up their clothes in the ancient carved wardrobe, whose worm-eaten doors were decorated with painted roses. When everything was stowed, Helena closed its creaking doors and turned the heavy ornate key. Then she went to the kitchen, where Lotte was already busy peeling potatoes and scraping carrots for a simple vegetable soup. Later, while Susi took her nap, the other 3 children went outside to explore. Soon Kurt rushed back into the house, ashen-faced. Kurt, what happened?" Helena cried. "What's the matter?" Unable to speak, he held out a dripping object. She took it out of his shaking hands and spread it on the kitchen table. It was a poster demanding that the youth who had escaped from being drafted into the army were to report immediately to the recruiting office. Any young draft dodgers caught in hiding would be immediately shot to death. "Kurt," Helena's voice shook, "where did this come from?" "I saw a Nazi official nailing it on the village announcement board. After he left, the wind tore the poster off and blew it into the creek. I was curious what it said, so I fished it out with a long stick. Oh, Mutti, what shall we do?" "We must tell the mayor," she said resolutely. "He has been kind in taking us in, but if he is discovered harboring a fugitive, he will be executed. We can't do this to him." Helena went into the yard where the butchering continued. "Herr Straub," she said in a low voice, "could you come into the house for a moment?" Seeing her obvious distress, he followed her into the kitchen, wiping his bloody hands on his pants.
Is something wrong, Frau Hasel?
He asked. Helena explained Kurt's find. Silently, the mayor read the poster spread out on the table. Then he crumpled it up and threw it into the glowing coals in the stove. Helena whispered, "Herr Straub, I have to confess something to you. We came here because Kurt was summoned for the draft. We cannot put you into such danger. Oh, what shall we do?"
Frau Hasel, the mayor said quietly, "the wind tore the poster off and blew it into the creek. I saw nothing, and I know nothing about it."
He sauntered over to the window, looked out, and returned to her side.
"I have a confession to make too," he told her soberly. "I have secretly been listening to the BBC's German-language broadcasts from London. As you know, it is forbidden to listen to the enemy station, and if I am found out, I will be arrested. But these, Frau Hasel, are desperate times and call for desperate behavior. I have learned that the Germans are broadcasting nothing but lies. We are not winning the war. In fact, the war will soon be over. The Americans are very close to Eschenrod and will be here soon, and we are not sending your boy into the fighting lines at this late stage. Thousands of untrained children like him are being slaughtered daily." He gestured toward the window. "Just like that pig out there. This is madness. You must keep Kurt hidden in the house, because we are not going to sacrifice him now."
Helena pressed Herr Straub's hand. It was impossible for her to speak. 2 weeks later, rumors circulated that the Americans were approaching. A steady stream of retreating German soldiers came through Eschenrod. Kurt stepped outside to watch the ragged troops of his defeated country file by. The captain of one unit spotted him.
"Boy, come here."
"Yes, sir?"
"I have several boxes of classified documents here," said the officer. "We can't transport them any longer. I order you to burn them. Show me to the village oven."
Kurt took him to the large brick oven where all the peasants baked their bread. The captain ordered his soldiers to carry the boxes there. They dumped them on the ground, then hurried after their disappearing comrades while Kurt began tossing the papers into the flames. For several hours he burned sheaf after sheaf of documents till the oven was red hot and clouds of ashes flew out of the chimney. The raging fire consumed documents marked secret and top secret, in which Hitler himself had given orders that directed the fighting on the Maginot Line. In the early afternoon, Herr Straub shot into the kitchen.
"The Americans are within 5 miles, he cried. "They'll be here in a couple of hours. Oh, what am I supposed to do?"
Thinking fast, Helena tried to calm him. "Why don't you send messengers to each house and tell the people to hang white sheets out of the windows," she suggested. "That will signal to them that we are surrendering." Grateful for the recommendation, Herr Straub did as she said, and soon white bed sheets billowed from every window as the first American trucks rumbled into the village. It was Good Friday, 1945.
"Attention, attention!"
The loudspeakers on their trucks crackled in German.
"Anyone leaving the houses will be shot. Remain in your houses."
Soon soldiers were banging on each door. Helena opened the Straub's door, and 35 men crowded into the house. They were very friendly, went into the kitchen, and started pulling out pots and pans. Using sign language, they asked for bread and fat to fry some eggs. Helena searched out the terrified Frau Straub, who was hiding in the attic. "Look, the men are hungry," she reasoned with her. "Don't let them wait so long. Give them some food. That's all they want." "They are going to eat up all my stores," Frau Straub lamented. "But if it has to be this way, give them a lump of lard and a loaf of bread." Helena shook her head. "That will never do," she insisted. "Don't be foolish. Give them enough to eat, otherwise they will take everything." "Your life is more important than a pot of lard." Finally, Frau Straub said, "Frau Hasel, you take over. Do what you think is right." Helena rushed into the cellar and got butter, eggs, crusty loaves of bread, pitchers of the home-brewed hard cider, and the blue earthenware crock of lard. Then she stoked the fire and started frying eggs. The leader of the GIs knew a few words of German and asked Helena for this and that. She quickly brought what was needed. While she was standing over the hot stove, one of the men came up behind her, put his arm around her and started to kiss her. In a flash, the commander was at her side. He loudly scolded the soldier and knocked him into a corner. After that, nobody dared bother her again. That night, as a dead-tired Helena went up the dark stairs to her room, someone tugged at her sleeve. She jumped in fright. "Who is it?" A female voice whispered, "Frau Hasel, please let me hide in your room. I don't feel safe by myself." It was Frau H., another Frankfurt woman who had found refuge with the Straubs. She had been in great danger at home because she had helped a Russian prisoner of war to escape. Word of this had got around the neighborhood, and she had to flee to avoid being arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Without a word, Helena took her by the hand and led her into the room. Susi was already asleep in her crib, and the other children got ready for bed. Kurt and 9-year-old Gert shared one bed, Lotta had another, and Helena and Frau H. decided to share the double bed. Before the children climbed into their beds, Helena knelt with them and prayed for protection in the night. "Frau H.," she said after the children were tucked in, "we don't know what this night will bring. We better not get undressed. That way we can be ready at a moment's notice." Suddenly, a timid knock sounded on the door. Helena opened the door a crack and saw the 12-year-old orphaned girl the Straubs had hired to herd their cows. "Frau Hasel, I am so scared. Please let me stay in your room," the shivering girl begged. Helena pulled her in and locked the door again. "You can share a bed with Lotta," she said, and tucked the girl in. Soon all was quiet and Helena fell asleep. At 2 a.m. she was awakened by shouting, screaming, and raucous laughter. Footsteps were coming up the stairs. Immediately she heard Frau Straub's voice outside the door. "Frau Hasel, open up quickly! The Americans want to inspect your room!" Helena jumped out of bed, thinking, now I and Frau H. are done for. The soldiers had already stumbled up the stairs, reeking of alcohol. Opening the door, she saw standing there the troop leader who had protected her earlier in the kitchen.
"Oh,"
he said in simple German.
"You here."
He shone his flashlight into the corners of the room and under the beds. Then he carefully played it over each bed. Other men wanted to push past him, but he stood broad-legged in the doorway, yelling at the others.
"Get out! Get out!"
He turned to Helena and asked, "Your children?" Silently, Helena nodded her head. He said,
"You good woman, you sleep."
He turned and motioned for her to lock the door behind him. Sabbath morning, when Helena went down to the kitchen to heat some milk for breakfast, she found several village women gathered there. "How did you get through the night, Frau Hasel?" they wanted to know. "I had no problems. I slept." "What? The soldiers didn't molest you?" To her horror, Helena learned that the drunken men had raped the women of the village, from little girls to grandmothers. None had been spared. Sobbing, the women sat around the table recounting the terrors of the night. Helena also heard stories of farmers who pretended they had nothing left when the soldiers came to ask for food. The enraged GIs went to the cellars where the food stores were kept and hacked to pieces everything they found. One family's daughter was going to be confirmed in the church the following Sunday. For months they had been hoarding food for the feast and hid it behind some fake paneling in the living room. The soldiers, knocking with their guns on the walls, discovered the hollow place, kicked in the paneling, and found bacon, ham, butter, eggs, and a big pot filled to the top with golden honey. Infuriated that they had been lied to, the men threw everything on the floor and trampled on it until it was all ruined. They saved the honey pot till last. Finally, one of the men grabbed it and defecated in it. "We even had to throw the pot away," the disconsolate woman reported. Later that day, the American commander gave orders that on penalty of death, no women were to be molested. But the damage had been done. Only the women around Helena had been spared. After breakfast, Helena gathered the children around her and conducted Sabbath school. They sang their favorite song, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," a bulwark never failing. The village streets were deserted, but no more violence occurred that day or the following night, which the terrified villagers spent behind bolted doors and shuttered windows. Life settled into a routine under the occupation forces. The Americans ruled with a light hand and became ruthless only when faced with what they considered treason. In a village near Eschenrod lived a farmer who had 4 sons. He had lost 3 of them in the war, and the one still alive was a member of Hitler's elite SS troops. Like all SS men, he had sworn an oath of loyalty to Hitler and felt he couldn't betray that and surrender to the enemy. When the Americans discovered him, they took him into a field and shot him, then cut off his head with a spade. Village children found his mutilated body, and he was brought back to his parents on an ox cart covered with straw. Heartbroken, the grieving parents buried their last son. In Eschenrod, Kurt, Gert, and Lotta enjoyed watching the soldiers. They were good-natured and jolly, and liked children, and sometimes gave them candy. One day, the first black men the children had ever seen joined the other GIs, and the children watched them in fascination, wondering if the black skin color might be shoe polish. Always daring, Gert decided it was time to do a bit of hands-on scientific investigation. He walked up to one of the black soldiers and held out his hand for a handshake. When he pulled it back, he carefully inspected his palm to see if any of the color had come off. The GI, noticing his curiosity, chuckled and encouraged him to touch his skin. Gert rubbed and rubbed on his arm, but it stayed black. Satisfied that it was genuine, Gert gave the man a big grin. The soldier pulled out a pack of juicy fruit gum, and Gert grabbed it eagerly, but then didn't know what to do with it. The man pantomimed chewing on it, and when Gert tried a piece, he suddenly discovered why the Americans were forever chewing. Spring came, and with it the Allied offensive intensified. At night, Mutti and Kurt watched the orange sky as many miles away Frankfurt was burning. Then one day they heard that Eschersheim, their own suburb, had been completely destroyed. "Kurt," Mutti said, "I won't have any peace until I know the truth about this. Why don't you take Papa's bicycle and go to Frankfurt and see if anything remains of our apartment?" "Sure," Kurt said, always ready for adventure. "If the apartment's gone, I'll find someone to stay with overnight. I'm going to give you some butter and flour for the apartment manager, and I'll wait for you tomorrow at the edge of the forest with bread and peppermint tea because I know you'll be hungry. Hurry now, and don't linger anywhere because the forests are dangerous." As Kurt reached an area of open fields, he suddenly heard the drone of approaching bombers high overhead. Bombs began exploding around him, and he toppled off his bicycle and lay flat. The planes had evidently been aiming for the railway station in nearby Gedern, but had missed their target. Once the thunderous blast ceased, he mounted his bicycle and struggled on. Then low-flying planes approached and started shooting at him. He threw himself into a ditch and hid his head in his arms, praying to God for protection. When all was quiet again, he continued on his way. After several hours, he saw in the distance Eschersheim's water tower, the landmark that was close to his apartment building. As he rode closer, he was amazed to see that amid the smoldering ruins, their apartment complex of 6 buildings still stood tall against the sky. He unlocked the apartment door and went inside. It was dark. The concussion of the bombs had blown the window glass out, and Herr Georg, the manager, had nailed heavy cardboard to the frames. Kurt gave him the items that he had brought with him from Eschenrod, and he and his wife, who had tuberculosis, gratefully accepted the much-needed food. The next morning, Kurt left the sad sights behind and once again headed into the country. It was hot, and he grew weak from hunger, but finally the Eschenrod forest appeared, and he saw Mutti waiting in the shade as she had promised. As he came around the last bend toward her, a pole jumped out of the bushes, grabbed Kurt's handlebars, and forced him off the bike. He shoved Kurt to the side, mounted the bike, and rode off. Mutti had seen what had happened. Just then a line of American tanks rounded the curve behind her. She darted into the road and stood in their path with outstretched arms. They stopped, but nobody could understand German, and after a few frustrating minutes they continued on their way. Mutti and Kurt walked to the village and hurried to the schoolhouse where the Americans were stationed. Does anyone here speak German? Mutti demanded. A young blonde soldier who had been whittling on a piece of wood while sitting on his cot stepped forward and asked in perfect German,
What do you want?
We need help. A Pole just stole my husband's bike from us.
Well, where's your husband?
My husband is in Russia. As they chatted, Mutti asked him how an American could speak German so well.
My mother came from a village not far from here, he said. She was very homesick and longed to come back, but my father showed no understanding. So when I was a little boy, she held me on her lap and taught me German Christmas songs. She said to me, Jim, we celebrate Christmas by giving presents, but we also remember God. Never forget that Jesus came into this world for us. She had such a good heart, but my father never allowed her to visit her homeland, and she died from a broken heart. Her last words to me were, Jim, find my village, find my father's house. There are beautiful flowers in the windows. Now I hope to visit there. Jim smiled at Mutti. Don't worry. If you can describe that bike carefully, we'll find it and get it back for you. Come next Wednesday morning. I'll leave it in the basement of that house across the road there. He pointed across the street. Mutti recognized the house. A former Adventist had moved there not too long ago. On Wednesday, Mutti went to the house and knocked on the door. No bike here, said the woman emphatically when Mutti asked her about it. Discouraged, Mutti turned away. But a moment later she noticed the landlord, who'd heard everything, motioning to her. She's lying, he whispered. That bike was delivered. The soldier told me to keep an eye out for you, so I did some checking. She's locked it in the cellar and covered it with blankets. Mutti crossed the street to the schoolhouse, found Jim, and told him what happened. Jim's face hardened. We'll see about that, he said, straightening his cap. They crossed the street together and Jim knocked at the woman's door. I brought a bike here yesterday, he said. Produce it. I know nothing about it, the woman said blandly. You either produce that bike, said Jim in his best SS trooper voice, or I'll arrest you. The woman's lips tightened, but her eyes lowered. Wordlessly she led them down to her cellar and gave them the bicycle. Oh, Mutti thought to herself as she wheeled it away. Oh, if the war could only end as easily. What was to become of them all? Was her husband still alive? Early one Sunday, the rumble of tanks rolling through the streets roused the frightened population. Kurt, his eye glued to a chink in the shutter, whispered, They are lining up by the bridge. Now soldiers are moving into position on the other side. Suddenly they heard a heavily accented voice announcing from a bullhorn mounted on an army jeep, Achtung, Achtung! All women and children must immediately assemble on the village bridge. This is an order. As the jeep disappeared, the order was repeated again and again, its echoes bouncing off the walls of the houses. Frightened, Gert clung to his mother's hand. Lotta, white as a sheet, asked, Mutti, must we go? What is going to happen to us? Helena made a quick decision. Kurt, I want you to go to the attic and hide. Make sure no one sees you. It looks like something bad is going to happen, and we may not come back. If our papa returns from the war, someone must be able to tell him what happened to us. Quick now! While Kurt ran up the creaking attic stairs, Helena quickly wrapped the other three in sweaters and shawls, all the while praying silently for protection. Then, taking Susi on her arm and instructing the other two to hold onto her skirts, she hurried to the bridge. It was already crowded with women and children, and their anxious whispers sounded around her. What happened? What is going on? What does this mean? Helena suddenly felt a peace descend on her. In her mind's eye, she could see angels guarding them. Up in the attic, Kurt found a knothole through which he could command a view of the village square. He saw the women and the children on the bridge. They were surrounded by Americans. On one side, the soldiers with their machine guns trained on the bridge. On the other side, tanks with their guns pointed at the women. There was no way of escape. Kurt saw the set lines in the men's faces and felt the tension of that moment. No longer able to witness what was sure to end in a bloodbath, he turned from his peephole, fell onto his knees and started beseeching God.
Lord, he prayed with all the intensity of his youth, I don't know what's happening down there, but it looks like the soldiers intend to kill the women and the children. Please don't allow their lives to be taken so close to the end of the war. Put your angels around them. In anguish, he continued praying. Down on the bridge, Helena looked around her. She knew many of the women. There was the landlady of the village inn who had been so unkind to her the first time she had been evacuated to Eschenrod. In the dead of winter, with little Susi only 2 months old, this woman had sent her to live in the unheated wash-house. There was the aged Frau Jost, who had taken pity on her and invited her into her own home. There was Frau Straub, the mayor's wife. There was the blonde Frau Bergmann, the pastor's wife, with her 5 children. The youngest was only an infant and had been born on the day she had received notice that her husband had been killed at the front. Helena had come to love this young woman who conducted weekly Bible studies in her home and took responsibility for the spiritual care of her husband's flock. In studying the Bible together, the 2 women had been able to support each other and had become very close. Good and bad alike, there they all were. What was to become of them? The somber-faced American commander stepped forward and announced through an interpreter,
I have asked you to assemble here because I have learned that you have committed a serious crime. Liberated Polish prisoners of war have revealed to us that you are hiding German soldiers in the village. As you know, this is treason. We will make you an example and execute you here on this bridge.
Pale and silent, the women looked at each other. Then Frau Bergmann, with her own baby in her arms and her other children around her, stepped forward. With shaking knees, she started, Herr Commander, I vouch for the fact that there are no soldiers hiding in the village. The Poles spread this lie out of revenge. We are innocent. We are defenseless. Surely you're not going to mow us down like a field of grain. Gravely, the commander replied,
Yes, that is just what I plan to do. You Germans did the same to your enemies.
Again, Frau Bergmann spoke up. Do you believe in God? He says, Revenge is mine. I will pay them back. Do you have children at home? The man nodded and lowered his head. Does your wife know of such a plan? She continued. What would she think of you? Do you have faith? Do you know that God sees everything? Isn't it enough that my husband fell in Russia? Must you now kill us and our innocent children? I didn't think that you Americans were so hard. At this, the commander signaled the soldiers to lower their guns. All this time, Kurt had been praying in the attic. Long before this, he had expected to hear gunfire. When all remained quiet, he crept up to the knothole and stared. While he could not hear what was being said, he saw immediately that the atmosphere at the bridge had changed. The soldiers had relaxed their stance. The women no longer looked paralyzed with fear. The commander addressed them once again.
Bring me 2 hostages, then I will let you go.
Soon 2 young men volunteered. They were war casualties, home from the front, one lacking an arm, the other a leg. Seeing these young invalids convinced the commander that no German soldiers were hiding in the village. He took the young men and sent them to camps in America. They saw a good bit of the country, had wonderful food, and returned after several months telling the envious villagers of the greatest adventure in their lives.